So, hello everyone. My name is Tatiana Zaylor. I'm a lawyer with Bennett Jones in Toronto and chair of Toronto Crew's Professional Development Committee. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to note that today's webinar is being recorded for archiving purposes and also for sharing with members that couldn't make it. This is our third installment of the Building Blocks series, which is designed to give you introductory knowledge and insight into aspects of the commercial real estate industry that you want to learn more about. Today, we're going to learn from our incredible panelists and moderator that are all Toronto Crew talent about building. The Professional Development Committee has been working hard to deliver enriching programming like this. And I want to specifically recognize the efforts of Lee Rosar of Bentall Green Oak, Pauline Petrie of X Design, and Samantha Kong of Avison Young for organizing this webinar. I also want to thank our platinum sponsors for their generous support of the Professional Development Committee's programming, without whose support webinars like this would not be possible. So let's get into it. Today's Building Blocks moderator is Michelle Hunt. She is an asset specialist, facilities maintenance at Walmart Canada, managing their waste and recycling portfolio. She is also the chair of Toronto Crew's Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Allyship Committee, also known as the IDEA Committee. She is also a Crew Network Foundation director and was the recipient of Toronto Crew's 2020 Rising Star Award. Let's welcome our moderator, Michelle Hunt.
Thank you, Tatiana. And I'm really excited to be a part of the Building Blocks series. I attended the first two and I really enjoyed them and learned a lot. And the same thing is here with our esteemed panelists. I've learned so much from them. And with that, I'm going to start off introducing our first panelist, Mary Wood. Mary is the Vice President of Leasing at Emery Investments, a privately owned real estate developer and landlord. With over 20 years of experience in commercial real estate, Mary began her career in brokerage as a salesperson in office leasing. In her current role, Mary manages the purchase, sale, and leasing functions of the Emery portfolio, which consists of industrial, office, retail, and land assets. Next is Maya Rahimian. Maya is the Director of Office Leasing at Oxford Properties Group, with 12 years of experience in the Toronto office leasing market. At Oxford Properties Group, Maya is responsible for the leasing and marketing of 3.6 million square feet of the GTA portfolio. Maya is a member of the Toronto Crew Board of Directors. Next is Michelle Ashe. Michelle is a law clerk in the real estate group at Dentons. She has extensive experience with all matters relating to commercial leasing, and she offers services to both retail, office, and industrial landlords and tenants, including national landlords and national and multinational retailers. Lastly is Megan Case. Meg is the Real Estate Leasing and Transaction Manager for the Americas at Magna International, with over a decade of experience on the landlord side of the business in leasing and property management at Oxford Properties Group and Cadillac Fairview. Meg switched over to the tenant side. She is currently responsible for a 46 million square foot portfolio of industrial and office properties. Meg has been an active member of Toronto Crew as a board member, mentor, chair, and a member of many committees since joining in 2011. With that, I'm going to do a brief overview of today's agenda. First, covering the market conditions, and this will provide us with a high-level view of leasing. Next is the tenant process. We'll get into the tenant mindset and understand their needs when acquiring a space. Next, we'll introduce a business case focused on office leasing. And we recognize that there is so much material to cover with office, retail, and industrial leasing. So for time and simplicity, what we've done is really focus on the office leasing as a business case. And then throughout the presentation, we'll sprinkle in some insights from the other other asset classes. Next, we'll do an overview of the timeline, touching on the different milestones throughout this process. Then move into a roundtable discussion with our panelists, really get some of their insights and perspectives, which I thoroughly have enjoyed through this process, listening to their expertise. Lastly, we'll move into a question and answer period. So if you have any questions, please feel free to enter it into the chat or into the Q&A function within Zoom. We'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation, and we'll bring it up and address them at the Q&A portion. Lastly, I wanted to highlight some of the key themes, but 3 themes that I've noticed throughout this presentation and listening to the panelists discuss leasing. The first key insight that I've noticed is the landlord perspective versus the tenant perspective, and understanding some of their considerations informs their negotiations. Second is the business terms versus the legal terms, and there's insights and implications for both. Lastly, it's the transactions versus the relationships. Even though when you look at leasing, there's all these various milestones and documents that need to be executed throughout this process, what really makes leasing come alive is the people, it's the relationships. And with that, we're going to kick off with the market conditions. Here we're showing some data that we've pulled from Altus Insight that gives us an overview of the office and industrial portfolios. So we're going to introduce Maya and Mary to this discussion, and they're going to give us their insights as to what do these data points mean and why are they important. So let's start off with Maya, and let's get into the office.
Thanks, Michelle, and hello, everyone. So looking specifically at the stats here for downtown Toronto financial core class A, total number of existing buildings is 54. Total existing area is 28.4 million square feet, and total availability rate is 12%. Now, the pandemic has had a negative impact on Toronto's office market. We've seen transactions decrease and tenants have put their space on the sublease market. And the sublease market has increased tremendously in the last 13 months. Now I'm going to pass it over to Mary to present the industrial view.
Thank you, Maya. Well, Milton Industrial shows a very different picture. We have 282 buildings in the industrial market in Milton, representing 24.3 million square feet. The vacancy rate, or the total available rate in Milton, is just 1.5%. You can see from this chart that there is no sublet space. The supply is low and the demand is high in Milton. And the pandemic has had a very positive effect on the industrial market. The explosion of e-commerce has resulted in a huge demand for industrial warehouse space. Landlords are starting to see net rents rise, multiple offers, and most landlords are now being very selective as to which tenants they want to put in their buildings, and they're basing it on their credit worthiness. So now that we have a brief overview of the market conditions, I'd like to turn it over to you, to Megan, who will walk us through the tenant process.
Thank you, Mary. It's so hard for me to hear you quote those industrial market stats. My portfolio at Magna is mostly manufacturing and warehouse space, so that's painful to hear. We do have quite a bit of office though. So for today's purposes, I will mostly be referring to a search for office space. I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes walking you through some of the things a tenant goes through when they need space. I wish this process took 5 minutes in real life. At Magna, we start with a questionnaire we go through with our business units. This just gives us a foundation to start with. We're just looking at what kind of space they need, approximately how much, when do they need it, for how long, and then we get into specific building features that are required. And this is night and day when you're doing an office deal versus industrial. So again, we're focused on office for right now. At this point, it's best to engage a workplace strategy or space planning team. This is where you really dive into your space needs. How do you use your space? How many offices? Who gets offices? That's the $1 million question sometimes. the number and size of meeting rooms, storage needs, how does your organization work, which teams need to sit with each other. Now, this exercise costs a little bit of money and it can take a little bit of time, but this is really important because it's going to give you the square footage that you should take out to the market. There is no point in going through this process to find out you looked for space that was way too big, or even worse, you find out your company won't fit. Now, the next step is to see what's out there. At Magna, we typically reach out to our brokerage partners at this point. We ask them to put together a market survey that shows all the options that could meet our criteria. It's really hard to keep up with the latest and greatest in all of the global markets in which we operate. Local brokers are really the best source of market information for someone like us. It makes sense for us to partner with the experts who have access to the local developer and landlord relationships as well. And sometimes we even have multiple brokers involved at the beginning of a project. If we're doing a site selection where we're not entirely sure which state or which province or even which country we're setting up shop in. In these cases, you also get into government incentives, but we don't have time to cover that today. So back to my single market example. Depending on your market conditions, you may have tons of options. The last big deal that we did in Michigan, we started with over 30 options. Or my favorite, you might not have any options, in which case in industrial, we have to go buy a piece of dirt and build something, but that's for another panel. So assuming you do have more than one option, it's time to shortlist. Now, shortlisting is always a very interesting exercise. There are usually quite a few cooks in the kitchen. You have the business unit leader, key members of their operations team. You have HR, obviously, you have real estate, and sometimes the C-suite even gets involved. In order to stay as objective as possible, it's best to use some sort of decision matrix and score all the attributes of each property. Use different weightings for each. For example, you're not going to give an equal weighting to parking spots as you are to access to natural light for your employees. Sometimes it's actually surprising to see which option takes the lead. When you score everything independently and add them up, it can be quite revealing. Now, once you have your shortlist, you'll want to tour the options to get a feel for what they're like in person. This has been a challenge in the past year during the pandemic, and Maya's going to touch on some ways we've dealt with that later in the presentation. Once you've toured and you've confirmed which sites you're really interested in, it's time to get your RFP, Request for Proposal, ready. Now, this is the document. It's very long, and it outlines all of the requirements and everything we would like to see included in the landlord's proposal. It's very important from a tenant perspective through this whole process to create leverage. Sending out multiple RFPs can sometimes help with this. The landlords need to know that you're considering a number of options. As part of the RFP, tenants will often ask the landlords to cover the cost of space planning. You need to see how the program you came up with earlier fits into each of these options. You may have thought you could fit into 100,000 square feet, but you actually need 120,000 square feet in your favorite building. Or maybe you thought you needed 100, but you can fit into 80 because one of the options has a really efficient floor plate. Now, the square footage you're going to commit to can have a considerable impact on how much this is going to cost, obviously. So this is a very worthwhile exercise to go through. We've had great buildings that we look at with fantastic rates, and it would be a great choice, but we just don't fit. So this brings us to the fun part, the budget and the financial comparison. I have to say, you're not just looking at rent here. You're looking at construction costs, which can be massive, and they can vary greatly from site to site. It's very unlikely that all of the options available to you will have the same base building conditions. You need to consider how much each landlord is willing to give you in terms of a leasehold improvement allowance, which we will cover later. And it's very important to note that this decision isn't always and should not be solely based on costs. There are many factors that go into this decision, including how the space impacts employees' happiness, health, and productivity. And this is where we come back to the decision matrix that I mentioned before. I'm almost done. Once a decision is made, we get to the LOI. This is the letter of intent. This is a document that outlines all the major deal terms that need to be sorted out before we move to the actual lease document. The lease can be upwards of 80 pages, and it can take weeks or even months to negotiate. And there's absolutely no point in engaging in that lengthy negotiation process if you can't even agree to the net rent or the term. Michelle Lachey is going to go through these major deal terms of the LOI later in the session. And speaking of legal, this is really the point you need to get your legal counsel involved if they aren't already. Legal teams are an extremely important part of the LOI negotiation. I'm going to hand it over to Maya now, who's going to walk us through what one of our options might look like if we were a tenant looking for space downtown Toronto.
Thanks, Meg. For our case study today, the offering is at 200 Bay. This is a complex of two towers, the North Tower and the South Tower. And the offering is in the South Tower. It's floors 34, 35, and 36. And they have a floor plate of approximately 24,000 square feet each, and it totals about 73,000 square feet. There is an internal staircase between floors 35 and 36, and the floors are in base building condition and ready for tenants fixturing. So as we all know, location, location, location. I'm sure you've heard this many times because it's important. The South Tower is located at the footsteps of Union Station, and the complex is path connected. The complex also has LEED EV Platinum certification and has numerous amenities such as parking, bike lockers, a fitness studio for the tenants of the complex, a wellness studio where tenants can go just to get away from their space, and there's corporate concierge, modern food court. There's an outdoor tennis where tenants can go eat during the summer or hold private events such as a barbecue. And we use our relationships with brokers to market our space. We also use our external website to market our space in real time, and we maintain strong relationships with our tenants. I'm going to pass it over back to Meg to provide an overview of our tenants.
Thanks, Maya. So we wanted to present a typical tenant that might be interested in this type of space that Maya and Oxford are offering. We need space for 335 employees. We need a AAA building in the downtown core. We'd really like some high profile visibility. Transit is important to us. And we're looking for office space that's going to provide a healthy and productive work environment for our employees. In terms of programming needs, we really want some flexible seating options given our new work from home policies. And we will need some private offices, but also some very inspiring collaboration space so that people want to come back to the office. Next slide, please. So going back to what I referred to earlier, let's pretend we've sent out our RFP. Oxford received it, they've responded, and we've decided we want to move forward with space planning these options that Maya has presented. We could spend hours going through what's actually on these feasibility plans, but what I want to point out is that upon review, it looks like this might be too much space for us. This could seat 393 people. And again, we only need 335 seats. So there are a few things that could happen here. We could try to consolidate an extra group who's external and maybe fit them into this footprint as well. Maybe we take the extra space and we have it to accommodate future growth projections. Or Maya, maybe you could comment on how we could take less than this space.
Absolutely. So as you can see from our first floor, the 34th floor, we can provide a multi-tenant floor in this complex. So you can see that floor has been split into 3 different suites. Now, depending on MMM Company's office space requirement, we can do one of 2 things. We can provide all 3 full floors. And if they didn't need that much space, we can provide a portion of the 34th floor and both the 35th and 36th floors in full. Now, specifically in this complex, it's unique floor plates as we have sawtooth layouts from what you could see on our plan here. Next slide, please. All right. So with the pandemic, most landlords have moved over to a virtual tour concept to help market their space. Here we have an example of a virtual tour using Matterport. Now, this is a suite from our North Tower on our district's floor. And Matterport not only takes virtual tours, but it also takes photos. And you can share these with your prospects or brokers. And a virtual tour is a great tool that allows prospects not only in Toronto, but global prospects the opportunity to tour the space and really get a feel for the views, the ceiling heights, the windows, and really it's the closest thing to a live tour. I want to share with you an example that I use a virtual tour and it helped me land and complete a deal. Back in June 2020, when the pandemic had started, we took our suites that were all available and put Matterport tours on all of them. And there was a client that was looking for approximately 2,500 square feet of space built out with furniture. And we had this available in the South Tower. I shared the link with their broker, and the prospects saw the virtual tour. And within 3 weeks, we were able to complete a deal without actually touring the space. Now, this is not just my experience. I've talked to other landlords, and they've mentioned similar situations. And at least the virtual tour has gotten their space on shortlist. And at the end of the day, the virtual tours have been really instrumental in leasing office space during this pandemic. Next slide, please.
All right. Well, thank you, Maya, for that overview. That looks like some great office space. And now we've kind of set the stage. We know the tenant's needs and we've seen the space. So now we're kind of starting at the offer stage, which is the proposal or the LOI, the letter of intent. And we go through these various stages, there's 5, to get us all the way to the lease negotiation stage. So with that, I have a question for Mary. How long does it take to get from the offer to the lease?
That's a very good question. It really depends on a couple of, well, several factors. I would say one of the factors is the level of sophistication of the landlord and the tenant. If they have management approvals, certain policies and procedures that they must follow, that takes time. The other factor is the motivation of the tenant. If the tenant has a sense of urgency, they will push this process along quickly. And also market conditions. In the industrial market, being such a low vacancy rate, there isn't much to choose from. So tenants will act quickly once a property comes on the market. They don't have many choices if that deal does not go through. So typical deals could be a month or they could be a year. It all depends on a lot of those factors. But I'd like to share with you the quickest deal of my career. And it was an interesting scenario. I was in the office, 9 a.m., received a phone call, and a president of a company was driving by one of our properties and noticed a for lease sign. She wanted to see the building right away. I met her at the building in the morning. We met in the boardroom at noon, carved out the deal terms, drafted a lease early afternoon, and discussed the terms, negotiated with the lawyers and with them. And by 6 o'clock that same day, we had a lease executed. That is very unusual, but I wanted to bring that up because that illustrates how tenant urgency and the motivation of the tenant can speed things along.
That's great. I have a follow-up question for you, and that's the role of the broker in this process. Could you delve into that a little bit?
Brokers can be involved representing the landlord and representing the tenant. On the tenant side, the engagement letter or the mandate letter outlines the role of the broker in representing the tenant. On the landlord side, it's usually a listing agreement that outlines the role of the broker in representing the landlord. Sometimes the one broker represents both the landlord and the tenant. In those situations, we refer to it as a dual agency. And dual agency should be disclosed up front so that all parties understand what their expectations are and the role of the broker, and that would require them to provide a dual agency disclosure document to avoid any misrepresentation or misunderstanding down the line. And then the final document that the brokers introduce is the commission agreement. That could be in the offering or could be a separate sideline agreement between the landlord and the broker. And the commission is paid for by the landlord, and it's paid upon lease execution or lease commencement date. So those are the documents, and that's pretty much their role in terms of providing expertise along the way. They can be involved on the tenant side right from the beginning when they do market overview, or the landlord at the offering stage.
Interesting. Thank you for that insight. I have a question for Meg, and the question is about relationships and how that could play a role in the leasing timeline. Could it shorten it? Could it make it longer? Could you provide some insight into that?
For sure. Relationships can definitely speed things up. We've had RFPs that we've sent out that include existing landlords, and we may not always completely agree with what comes back in their first proposal, but with those existing relationships, we know we can get there together. So we have been known to skip the LOI altogether sometimes in these situations and just go straight to lease using a form that is already negotiated on a previous deal. I will say it's not as easy as sign here, I wish, but the basics have been covered, and it chops off a considerable amount of time when you can do this. So that's the documentation side. Another example is we're often under extremely tight timelines on our industrial builds. So it's been helpful on certain projects where we have a relationship with a landlord who we already know, and we may not have a lease signed yet. Everybody's working towards it. But in the absence of having a document, we know we will come to an agreement, and there's a level of trust there. So sometimes those developers will get started on their drawings, their bid packages. They'll go out and they might even start ordering materials if we're really lucky, and then we can finalize the lease at the same time. So that's been really helpful to us. Just in general, I think relationships can make any difficult conversation along the way that much easier to manage. And those do happen. And the relationships can be instrumental in getting deals across the finish line. Maya and I were talking, we definitely have situations when you're doing leasing and things can get contentious, especially on the legal side. So I've had situations where the legal team reaches out and just says, can you call the business contact on the other side? And I'll call them and we have a one-on-one conversation, and then it's a tough conversation, but those conversations are a lot easier to have when you know what they did last weekend, or you know their kids' names, or you've chatted about life in general over lunch. So yes, relationships are key.
That's good. Thank you for that. All right. So from this, we're going to cover some of the major terms of the LOI. There's lots of terms here, but I'm going to introduce Michelle to this, and I'd love for her to give you some insight as to some of these terms. Can you pick out a couple of them and let us know, explain them?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Now that the parties have agreed on the business terms of the deal, it is time to formally document their agreement in an LOI or a lease proposal. So in this part of the webinar, I will go through some of the key terms found in a proposal. And at the end, I will briefly touch on other special terms or provisions that the party may have been negotiating or they have agreed to between them. They are not standard provisions, but you see them from time to time. Please keep in mind that the following is only an overview of the terms. It's not an exhaustive list, but it will give you a good idea of what a proposal might look like. And the simplicity or the complexity of the proposal depends on the multitude of factors, but for this presentation, we're trying to keep it like as simple as possible. The first thing that you'll probably see on the proposal, and it's obvious, it's the landlord's name, the tenant's name, and the address of the property. You just want to make sure that that this information is accurate because of the legal implications. Then the other thing you're going to see is the premises. This is where the premises that are the subject of the transaction will be described. The section will list the suite number, the floor on which the premises are located, And it will also state the rentable area of the premises, which is the area on which the rent will be calculated. So it's important that we have that rentable area correct. And also linked to this section at the back of the, attached to the proposal will be a floor plan showing the premises, the approximate location of the premises. Then another important term of the proposal is the actual term of the tenancy, the term of the lease. It will be like a period, for example, of 5 years. It will state the commencement date, which, for example, could be July 1st, 2021, and will expire on May 31st, 2026.
Oh, fantastic. I see the next term here is fixturing period. I know this term. This happens before the term starts, right? Can you dig into that a little bit?
Absolutely. You're absolutely correct. The fixturing period occurs prior to the commencement date. It's a period during which the tenant has non-exclusive access to the premises for the purposes of completing the work required to ready the premises for the tenant's use. The duration of the fixturing period is agreed upon by the parties ahead of time, and it's based principally on the size of the premises and the scope of the work that is required to the premises. Because smaller space takes less time, or it depends the state, well, if it's in base building condition or if it's already been improved to a certain degree. So that will all play out. And like we said before, the fixturing period occurs prior to the commencement date and will end on the day just before the commencement date. So notwithstanding that the term of the lease hasn't commenced when the fixturing period occurs, all of the terms and conditions of the lease will apply during the fixturing period, except for the payment of rent. Net rent, operating costs, and realty taxes will not be payable in respect of the premises. But it is, all the other terms will apply, and that's why this is part of the reason why the landlords will not provide possession of the premises to the tenants until they have a signed lease. I would just add that I said that the operating costs and realty taxes were payable, but were not payable during the fixturing period, sorry. But utilities are normally a cost that the tenant will have to cover during the fixturing period.
Mm-hmm. Well, I definitely understand the tax part and the taxes that you have to pay and the utilities, but not. Can you maybe talk about the operating costs?
Yes, operating costs. We will, when we talk about additional rent a little later, we will address it again. But operating costs, it's always defined in great length in the leases. But just to give you an idea, just generally, operating costs are the cost and expenses that are incurred by the landlord in administering, operating, managing, maintaining, insuring, repairing the property. So in a nutshell, that's what it is. It's operating, the cost of operating the building or the shopping center. So I will go back to the fixturing period, and just after the fixturing period, you will see sometimes that the landlord has agreed to perform work in the premises at its cost. So this is called the landlord's work. And the proposal will outline the specific scope of the landlord's work. The landlord's work will be, for example, could be replacing carpet, maintaining repainting walls, or replacing damaged ceiling tiles. Again, this is something that the parties will negotiate. It depends on what the space already looks like, what the tenant needs. So it's a negotiated term. And all the work that is required to be performed to the premises other than the landlord's work, if the landlord has agreed to perform landlord's work, is called the tenant's work. That's the work that is required in order to ready the premises for the tenant's use. The tenant's work will be completed at the cost of the tenant, and it's usually performed during the fixturing period, and all work is subject to the landlord's prior approval. The landlord wants to know what's going to be done in the premises, and the landlord wants to approve the work. And if permits have to be obtained or plans have to be done for the work, the tenant will prepare them or have them prepared at its cost, and will apply with the permit, will obtain the permit, and the plans will be approved also by the landlord. So that takes care of getting the space ready for the tenant's use. Now let's talk about rent. The rent, there are two components of the rent for the purpose of this discussion. There's a net rent, which you've heard my fellow panelists talk about earlier. And the net rent is an amount payable by the tenant to the landlord every month. And it is calculated based on a fixed amount per square foot of the rentable area of the premises. If you've heard the term base rent, basic rent, or minimum rent, it's the same thing as net rent. They all mean the same thing. So, as I said before, net rent is fixed, but it doesn't mean that it's not subject to escalation. For example, the parties may have agreed that the net rent will increase by $1 per square foot every year throughout the term. But for example, in year one, the tenant will pay landlord $20 per square foot. Second year, $21 per square foot. Year three, $22 per square foot, and so on and so forth. Once the parties have agreed on the fixed net rent rates for the term, though, those rates will not change. They're agreed upon, they're fixed, they won't change. Net rent, as its name suggests, is net of additional rent, which I will now address. Additional rent means all other amount payable by the tenant pursuant to the lease in addition to the net rent. The additional rent includes operating costs, like we just talked about, realty taxes, utilities, all in respect of the premises, and also include, for example, the cost of any additional service provided to the tenant in addition to the standard services provided to all the tenants in the building. For example, if you need light bulb replaced, or if you need HVAC outside of the normal business hours of the building, it will be charged to the tenant as an additional cost. Like net rent, operating costs, realty taxes, and utilities are also payable monthly. But the monthly amount in respect of operating costs and realty taxes and utilities, again, are based on estimates determined by the landlord prior to the beginning of each year. At the end of the year, the landlord will reconcile the amounts of additional rent paid based on actual amount and for the year, and then any adjustment will be made between the parties if adjustments have to be made. If the tenant have paid the total amount of the estimate paid by the tenant is lower than what the actual amount is, then the tenant will have to pay the difference. And if the total amount of the estimate is higher than what the actual amount is, then the landlord will refund to the tenant. Another provision of the LOI that you may see is a deposit or a prepaid rent or a security deposit. A deposit or prepaid rent is an amount that the tenant will pay to the landlord on account of rent to be paid during the term. It will be paid prior to the commencement date, and it may be on account of, for example, the first and the last month rent, or any other months that the parties have agreed to. It could be the first 2 months, the first last month, any month in between. It's as they agreed to. And there is also a security deposit, which is different than the prepaid rent. The security deposit is an amount that the tenant will pay to the landlord as a security for the tenant's performance of its obligation. I'm sorry, my computer said it's about to restart, so I'm going to snooze this. Security deposit, I'm sorry, security deposit is an amount delivered to the landlord as a security for tenant's performance of its obligation under the lease. If during the term, the tenant is in default of any of the provision of the lease, the landlord will then be able to draw from the security deposit to compensate the landlord for example, rent that is outstanding or for any loss or damage incurred as a result of the default. If the landlord uses a portion of the security deposit, the tenant must restore the original amount of the deposit. The landlord will ask the tenant to do that. And one last term, standard term or general term that I will address is the use of the premises. The use of the premises sets for the specific use of the premises by the tenant. The tenant will want as much flexibility as possible and will want the clause to be as broad as possible, while the landlord, as you can imagine, will want the use to be as narrow and concise as possible. Once the use have been determined, the landlord can only use the premises for the use outlined in the proposal or in the lease, and any change of use will require the prior consent of the landlord.
All right, so those were all the kind of common terms that you would find in the proposal. And now there's some special provisions. Could you kind of outline some of those? And just a heads up, we do have one question that came in that's relevant to the tenant's allowance and leasehold improvement. So maybe after you go through those definitions, we could address that question maybe and see what the answer is.
So one of the special term or special provision that we're going to talk about is actually that the tenant allowance or the leasehold improvement allowance. It is an amount that the landlord will provide to the tenant to help the tenant pay for the cost of the tenant's work. It could be a fixed amount. It could be an amount per square foot. And it is typically paid upon satisfaction of certain preconditions. For example, the allowance will only be paid once the work has been completed in full, when the landlord is satisfied that all the trades and sub-trades have been paid, and that the permits that were the construction permits that were required for the work have been closed. So that's like a very broad description of what the tenant allowance is. Another provision or term that we often see is an option to extend. An option to extend, the tenant may request that it be granted with an option to extend the term at the expiry of the initial term. So for example, at the expiry of our 5-year term, initial 5 term, the tenant will have the option to extend the 5-year term for example, another period, one period of 5 years. And so the total term of the lease will be 10 years. The extension period, the additional 5 years, will be on the same terms and conditions as those already set out in the lease, save and except for net rent, which will either be as agreed upon by the parties when they negotiated this option to extend, or will be, since we don't know what the future holds, will be determined based on the fair market rent for the premises for the extension period. It's be negotiated maybe like 3 months, for example, prior to the commencement of the extended term. Again, the option will be granted based on certain precondition, and the tenant has to advise the landlord that it will exercise its option within a certain period of time. For example, not less than 6 months prior to the expiry of the initial term. And if the tenant does not provide that notice, it loses its option. It doesn't have the right to extend. I'm sorry. Did you want to ask me that question about leasehold improvement? I was on a roll here. I didn't.
Yeah, I didn't
stop.
want to interrupt you. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, you know what we should do? Why don't you finish, and then we can bring this up maybe as a roundtable discussion. Maybe that's the best way of addressing that question. So yeah, continue with the definitions. Thank you.
Sounds good. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I was just briefly gonna name like a few other special provisions that you see. For offices, sometimes you will see special parking rates. The tenants will want to know that they have parking in the underground parking space of the building. You can negotiate that. And there are also special signage rates. Pylon, if there's a pylon serving the building, the tenant may ask to be represented on that pylon sign. There are transfer rates that the tenant, depending on the organization or structure of the tenant, they may require special transfer rate that will be granted to the tenant without having to go to the landlord for consent. And one last one that I'm gonna add to the list is the expansion rate. So you don't know what the future holds. So some tenants would like to know ahead of time that they would be able to expand their premises if they have to expand. So just as I will conclude just by saying that all of the business terms that are included in the proposal or in an LOI will be reflected in the lease. But like we said before, the proposal is usually around 8, 9, 10, 12 pages maximum, while the lease can be up to 60, 80 pages. So it's for certain that certain terms of the proposal will be expanded in the lease and to address all, to iron out all everything that needs to be ironed out around the terms, but everything will be addressed in the proposal. But the essence and the intent that was agreed to at the proposal stage, or what's in the proposal though, that will be reflected in the lease.
Well, thank you for that insight. I'm gonna loop in Meg and Maya for that tenant and landlord perspective. And looking at this list, can you pick out your top 3 most contentious terms that you've come across in your experience? Starting with Meg.
Oh, okay. No, Maya, you go first.
Okay. I know Meg's gonna have some good ones, but I'll let her start with, I'll let her put those points out. But I do know that I've seen the landlord's relocation right and landlord's demolition right be contentious. I'm sure Meg's going to touch on net rent as well. That's going to be for both of us. And I know for these 2 rights, or specifically the landlord's relocation right and the demolition right, they provide flexibility for the landlord, but depending on the tenant and their size, it might not be as easily accepted from their perspective.
Yeah, I can't even imagine a relocation or demolition right in a Magna lease. That's just, I'm going to focus on industrial for this answer, if that's okay. Yeah, net rent, it probably gets the most attention, especially internally. It takes up a lot of my time, and we could talk about how we agree upon net rent for a long time. But the business units probably give the most attention to this term. And then part of our job is to explain how all of the other parts of the lease can actually affect them, like repair and maintenance, that type of thing. But there's a lot of focus on net rent, and there's a lot of negotiation on it. I would say another one that comes up all the time, to be honest, when we get our RFP responses, I like immediately go to this one, is renewal options. We spend a lot of money and we put a lot of capital into our facilities, and our groups need to have comfort that they're not going to get kicked out. So we try to tie everything to booked business and the way the contracts are set up. And for that reason, we like to have that shortest notice period. Michelle Lachey had mentioned, 6 months before expiry. Sometimes it's 12. We'd like it to be as close to expiry as possible to give us more time to figure out how long we can commit for. And then the biggest contentious part of this option is what the rent's going to be. So we like it to just be fair market value. And the landlords always want it to be no less than current. So that's where we always start, it seems, and then it goes from there. And sometimes we'll get, 95% or 75%, or sometimes it's even, must be 2 or 5% higher than the last year. So I don't like it when we start there. And then another one is assignment and transfer, and that it's probably pretty typical, but unique to Magna in that we create a lot of joint ventures and we move our entities around a lot. So we really need to carve out what we would consider permitted transfers in that provision. And then the last one I would say is expansion rights. We need a certain amount of space when we have a certain deal, but we also know that with that booked business, we might have 100,000 square feet that the program fits into, but we already know when we're signing the deal that in the next 2 years, we're going to need another 30,000 square feet. So we put that right in at the beginning. And I could talk about expansion rights for a long time, but those are the ones that I would say get the most attention.
Awesome. Thank you. So with that, we get to move on to the conditional period. And we actually have a sample document, a waiver in the next slide that just kind of gives you an overview of what the conditions or possible conditions are. But I'd like to lean on Mary for some of her insight as to some of the conditions that she's seen, and also Meg from an industrial perspective, because you provide some insights as to conditions that you've come across.
Okay. We are looking at 2 conditions listed here on our screen: landlord's conditions and tenant's conditions. We'll address the landlord's conditions first. Probably the number one cause of deals falling apart is due to the landlords not being satisfied with respect to the tenant's financial status. Landlords would request financial statements, Dun & Bradstreet, bank references, and any other financial information to help satisfy them of the status of the tenant and to mitigate their risk on a particular transaction. There are times, though, when obtaining financial statements is difficult, or obtaining deposits in a particular transaction. And I had an example many, many years ago when many of you may have remembered that Target was moving into Canada. And they were offering on one of our properties to lease an industrial building. And they refused to provide a security deposit, which is our standard procedure. When we looked at the offer, it was listed as Target Canada. And Target Canada did not exist at that time. It was basically a startup company. What we asked them to do for us instead was to have the parent company in the US indemnify the lease. An indemnification or a guarantee would provide us with security that the lease would be paid in case they went bankrupt in Canada. And as we all know, they did go bankrupt in Canada. So we ended up getting the lease paid in full, and it was actually a better solution than just getting a security deposit of 1 month. So that's an example where financials sometimes are not available, but there are other ways of mitigating that risk depending on the situation.
Yeah. Sorry, Mary, I don't want to cut you off. Are you finished there?
Oh, by all means,
Okay.
cut me off.
Yeah, it's interesting from the landlord's conditions on financials. We always know that that's a possibility. So we typically address it right up front. And we tell the landlords right from the beginning that we probably won't give them anything. So that's always a fun conversation. So we never get held up, or we never lose a deal at the end because of this, because we try to address it early on. But the other one that we typically see, Michelle, to answer your question, is on the industrial side is environmental. We always have right in there that we need to be satisfied with or we need to complete a phase 1 and be satisfied with the results. So that's something that, you know, isn't as common in office, but that we have in all of our documents.
Mm-hmm. Two other conditions I think that were brought up in our discussions were board approval and zoning. Does anyone want to kind of give a little bit of insight to, you know, those ones? I believe the board approval would be typical for an office condition potentially, and then for zoning, how does that play a factor?
Do you want me to tackle that one? Zoning?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll use the example of an industrial building also. Oftentimes, when tenants are looking for industrial space, they have a condition for zoning approval, and that is really a condition that is for the benefit of the landlord and the tenant, because both parties want to make sure that the zoning is accurate and acceptable. One common zoning issue is we get a lot of auto parts and auto body shops going after some of our smaller units, and that type of zoning is very rare, and it also introduces a lot of other issues like environmental issues. So that can be a deal breaker. If the business cannot operate an auto body shop and that's their business, then that's not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. All right, so I think that kind of covers the conditional period, and then we would go on to the acceptance of the proposal. And if you go to the next slide. So this is the waiver that we're just showing you a sample. This contains all of the conditions that we've previously discussed on an earlier slide. So that's just kind of a view or a sample. And then the next stage after that is the lease negotiations. So we're going to open it up to a roundtable here. And really kind of delve into, you know, the different stakeholders that could be involved at this stage, because you've moved through, you've accepted the proposal, but there's still some finer details that need to be hashed out between those parties. And it would be interesting to find out, you know, who's at the table, who's making those decisions or helping to clarify those further provisions as you get into the lease document. I was wondering, Maya, if you wanted to take a stab at that.
Yeah, absolutely. So once the lease is drafted, both the tenant and the landlord have comments to the lease, and further negotiations are done during this time period.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, you mentioned some of the stakeholders that could be present depending on what the provision that you're discussing, right? So you mentioned sometimes the asset management team is involved. Is there, you know, other parties that would be interested in some of these terms?
Yes, absolutely. So I found that I get involved, or legal gets involved, and as you mentioned, asset management, and depending on if there's a risk or insurance question. And then I've seen from the other side, tenant's perspective, the main tenant contact, their legal, their broker, and really any other tenant contact or from the tenant side that needs to be involved, that's a decision maker, really gets involved in the lease negotiations.
Mm-hmm. I believe, Meg, you mentioned like a developer could be interested in the lease negotiations, or at least when it's going to be complete. Could you maybe go into that a little bit?
They always want it to be complete as soon as we get it. So I think what I was talking about when we were prepping is, you know, you've got the the lawyers go off and they're talking about the lease. You've got your construction team waiting to move dirt. You've got the business unit who's like, okay, are you going to meet our dates? And everyone's kind of scrambling and saying, where's the lease? Where's the lease? Yeah, so you definitely hear from the developers about, when's it going to get signed. Sometimes we get into an extra agreement where we agree to reimburse a landlord up to a certain amount, so they can get started, so that we don't have slippage on the dates. An agreement of reimbursement, that type of thing, especially if you have like a steel order, because you usually have someone saying, well, the lease isn't signed, I'm not ordering the steel. You're like, you have to order the steel or the building's not going to be ready. And then you've got your business unit saying, why isn't it signed? And anyway, so this is kind of how lease negotiations feel. Like, it gets a little hectic, but you always get there in the end and everybody works together. So, yeah.
Does anyone else have any anecdotes or insights to this stage? No? Okay, alrighty. So one of the kind of, hopefully we can have a bit of a roundtable discussion about, I know this was a bit of a, we had a lot of discussion around binding, non-binding offers. Is that something that we can delve into in this roundtable? Maybe get everyone's perspective on that?
I could jump in. I think we were talking about how the LOI typically is non-binding. Sometimes if it's a really tight market and, for example, we've had situations just in the past year where we did have to make the LOI binding just to have the landlord stop marketing the space. So they need the commitment from us that we're moving forward. We need the commitment. They're not going to have someone come in and say they'll pay more for it. So we will at the end sometimes convert it to binding, but at every turn of the document, I always make sure it says non-binding, just so that we're, because we still need to get that board approval that Mary was talking about before. And then we can't sign anything until we have that. So you have to make sure it's non-binding for the majority of that first part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, from a landlord's perspective, we want the documents to be binding. So it really is from the perspective of what or where you're looking from. And also the size of the tenant does play a big role in terms of what you get, whether the document is binding and non-binding.
Fantastic. Okay. Maybe we could talk a little bit around how easy the technology with the virtual tours have really impacted leasing, or even doing site visits. I think there's the ease where you don't necessarily have to go, especially if you have got a global footprint, right? You're not traveling. Maybe we could talk about, maybe is that something that we're seeing as an increased trend due to the pandemic, or is that here to stay?
Oh, for sure, it's here to stay. I think a lot of people have realized, the best use of their time, and some like tours, like Maya and Mary, I'm sure some of your tour days could be a full day, right? So if that can facilitate giving people back a bit of time, especially when you're shortlisting, right? You don't need to travel to each place, because you can often see in the virtual if it's a good fit or not. And yeah, from my perspective, I couldn't go to the States for this past year. And so it's not technology, it's relationships. You need to rely on the people who are there. I had one of my construction managers FaceTime me for a developer tour, and every site he would FaceTime me. And it was kind of funny because it's like, well, yeah, it looks like a piece of dirt, but it's still, you're using technology and you're on FaceTime with this team, and they're showing you everything, and you don't have to go there, and it saves the company money too, right? So
yeah. And if I can just echo what Meg was saying, I too had a tour, and unfortunately I wasn't able to be there, but the broker was FaceTiming me, and I literally completed my tour through FaceTime with the client and the broker through the space, which is definitely abnormal prior to, this whole pandemic. And we've had a couple of prospects from the US. They typically would have got on a plane, come to Toronto, had a day's worth of tours laid out, and a broker would have taken them through. And now they're asking, okay, well, given, especially with the lockdown and also the quarantining, with the hotel quarantining, it's very challenging for them to come from, specifically from the US across the border. So the virtual tours have been tremendous in at least narrowing down and putting our groups on shortlist.
Does anyone have anything else to add? Okay, well, I'm going to pose an audience question here. It starts, is there a best practice ratio for tenant allowance, leasehold improvement cost sharing between the tenant and the landlord?
Was it the question that I was supposed to answer earlier?
It's for everybody, yes. But
Okay.
Michelle, if you could jump in, I would love that.
I will jump in, and the honest answer from me is I don't know if there is a best practice ratio. I think it's everybody knows that if a tenant allowance is granted, it would be the amount of it will be factored in the net rent that the landlords will get. But I don't know if Maya or Meg, if you have any idea if there is a best practice, but I'm inclined to say no, there isn't, but maybe there is.
Yeah, no, I can definitely share. From my perspective and a landlord's perspective, there's no real best practice. I think we look at who the tenant is and what their financial status is, their credit worthiness, and then we base the tenant allowance or the leasehold improvement based on that. And then, as Michelle mentioned, it goes into the net rent. So from our perspective, no, there's no actual ratio.
Yeah, and we often get feedback on the length of the deal term. So they'll say, we'll give you this amount of money for a 5-year or this amount for a 10-year. And then, yeah, it's negotiated, I guess is what we're all saying.
Yeah. Right, it depends, it's situational.
Yeah.
Another question that came through is around environmental programs. Are they swaying deals at all? For example, would one building get chosen over another if they offer better environmental programs, even if there's a premium, even if a premium was required?
I can, sorry, go right ahead, Meg.
I was just gonna say, it depends who's making the decision, first of all. But Maya, you, as a landlord who has environmental programs, you can comment on that one.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I'm understanding this right, like if our buildings, we find that there's, let's use well, for example, and or LEED EB, if there is gold or platinum, I'm finding that tenants do have a checklist of if there's programs involved. But I think it's really about the space as well. If a space is perfect in one building and they might be gold as opposed to platinum, I don't think the tenant will pass on that or forgo that and say, no, we really want platinum building. It really depends on the tenant and their requirement. But Meg, if you want to provide some clarity around that too.
Well, I was just gonna, don't worry, you're not supposed to read this, but here's an example of one of my decision matrix lists. And, sustainability, you've got 6 or 7 sustainability attributes, and each one of those is scored independently, and then it's weighted in the whole sheet. So it depends on the weighting. It depends on who's scoring it. I would say for office space, what I saw is that tenants really do care that your landlord is sustainable. On the office side, we could talk about industrial and environmental another day. But yeah, I think people want to have their employees in a building that is sustainable for sure. It's just how much of the weighting is it?
I think a lot of companies have it as their mandate. They have it as a company profile. This is what they want. They want a LEED gold or LEED silver. However, when it comes down to the negotiation and when they see what that means in terms of a premium rent,
Yeah.
then they start backpedaling.
Yeah.
They have their wish list. I want all this, but then it's going to cost us this much more. And then we find that they often compromise and they get some of the wish list, but not all of it.
That's fair. Sometimes you want the world, but you actually can't afford to get all of those different features. Actually, there was another question that we wanted to address, which was what does the landlord do to attract tenants to the space or promote the space that's available on the market? I think, Maya, you had some insight to that. Or, you could explain what Oxford does.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a really extensive distribution list of brokers that we heavily market to and send emails. And in some cases, we curate a specific list of brokers that we know work with certain sectors to help us market the space. Now, prior to the pandemic, we used to have incentive programs, trips, lunches, go to sporting events, bonus commissions. And given the pandemic now, we have created a comeback commission program where we pay $1.20 per square foot to brokers for our deals, but any deals completed in 2021 that are new will pay an additional 80 cents per square foot in Oxford gift cards to help incentivize our retail counterparts as well. I think they need a lot of help right now, so anything we can do to help them out, we're trying.
That's great. I mean, I think Oxford gift cards did a good time like this. You would definitely appreciate that. So another question that came through is, do any of you have any mistakes you've made in your earlier careers that you think the attendees would benefit from hearing?
Nope, never made any mistakes.
What kind of mistakes?
Yeah.
Kind of mistake.
That's an open-ended question. Oh, we could go on a long time on that one.
But what do you want to admit to? Yeah, exactly.
Well, mistakes with respect to leasing, leasing mistakes.
I've got one very simple one that I think I had mentioned to you guys. I once mistakenly had a call set up with one of the landlords and our legal counsel. and she looked at the invite and it was like 10 minutes before the call. And she said, "Wait, is there a lawyer on the phone?" I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Well, you can't do that." And so that was interesting to me that, you can't have legal representation on one side and not the other. So that was like a very simple black and white mistake. It was great because I just said, our legal will be there. And then they said, "Great, I'll get mine." It was fine. But that's an easy mistake that I'm willing to admit that I made. Now you all have to admit one too.
Yeah, well, I think a common mistake that we make from the landlord's perspective is we get a call from a broker saying that this is my client, and we just take them at face value, or we assume that he's telling the truth or she's telling the truth, and then we proceed. And in fact, they are not representing the client. They had a conversation with the client and they're trying to create this relationship potentially. And I think that's a mistake that I made at one point, and we resolved it. But I think that points out how important it is at the very beginning to ask the question, do you have a mandate with this particular client? And do you have a mandate letter signed? Because if you start talking to one broker, before you know it, there's another one in the picture and they all want to get paid. And you say to them, "I'm paying one commission. I'm not paying 5 commissions for 5 brokers." So it's very important to be very clear as to what their role is and to identify them as being the broker of representing whoever they say they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I can share a story. Now, this wasn't my mistake. It was an error that I caught, but it was good because it could have been my mistake. I had a deal that I was working on with a broker, and the deal was conditional. And I had, prior to sending out the, or at the same time when I sent out the proposal, I sent out our standard Oxford lease amending agreement template, which we normally attach, when we send out our proposal. And while the deal was conditional, I got an email from the broker saying, hey, when am I going to get paid? And I was like, the deal's actually still conditional. What do you mean? I haven't received your waiver. And he sent me the document, which was our standard lease amending agreement. It was executed by the tenant with no information at the top of it. It was just our blank lease amending agreement, and the tenant has executed. And I was about to be like, okay, like, so I guess you're waiving and we're moving forward. And I looked through the document and I was like, this document doesn't have any of the information on it. Like, it could have easily been a big mistake had we moved forward, but it's really important to read every single line of the documents and ensure that, everything that, it could be an agreement that's signed, but it's a blank agreement. So it really means nothing at the end of the day. So I had to go back to the broker and be like, I know you want to get paid. I understand this, but we got to get the waiver, and we got to get the tenant to sign an actual agreement that has all the information on it. So things to really look out for.
There is a very linear process that these milestones have to be hit before you move on and get to the end. You can't really, you can obviously a deal can be done in the day, but all of those documents need to be signed, all the T's crossed and the I's dotted. Great story. Well, if we have any more questions, does anyone have any other insights that they'd love to share with our audience? Okay, well, we can, wrap it up and kind of talk about or just highlight some of our upcoming events that we have about coming. Sorry, the slide talks about what happens next after the deal signed and you build or you move in. So that completes that stage. I'd also like to mention that we can send out the PowerPoint slide and also so that you can have it as a reference. Also, we can compile some of the terms that we showed with the LOI so that you can have that as a reference document as well. So those are, we got one last question coming in. We can take a minute if you don't mind to answer that last question that just came through. Is there a typical cost per square foot rent based on asset classes that you can share?
I think I'd have to direct people to, connect with brokerage firms or Altus and get some market reports, because one submarket, it could be a whole spreadsheet of information. So this question here is a whole other panel.
For sure. Just a quick question. Is there a difference in rates from, direct versus subletting? Can there be variance as well through that?
Yes, absolutely.
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah, there could be.
Sublet is cheaper, but generally speaking.
The sublease is an agreement between the actual tenant and the subtenant. So they may agree that the subtenant will pay a portion of the total rent, but the tenant remains responsible for the entire amount to pay to the landlord. It's an agreement between the two, what makes sense for them.
So that could be a way you can shave off a couple of dollars by going the sublease route versus direct with the landlord potentially.
Yeah, but then you get into, the landlord may prefer to terminate your lease, like mutually agree, terminate your lease, get them as a head tenant. And, I said it was cheaper, but it depends on the market. In another market, sublet might be more expensive. And then you get into, is there a provision in your lease that if you're charging more than you're paying the landlord gets a cut of that as well. Yeah. So, yeah.
It can get quite complicated.
It does.
All of this can.
Fantastic question that came through. Thank you. Yeah, so we're just going to wrap up if there aren't any more questions and just highlight some of the upcoming events that Toronto Crew has. We've got the virtual happy hour on May 11th, and we've got the book club, which I've heard great things about, and a new webinar coming up on the new normal post-COVID. I'm excited to hear about that as well. That's coming up on May 26th. The AGM, the annual general meeting, on June 17th, and our annual Golf Classic event, September 17th. So mark your calendars. And with that, thank you so much, and really enjoyed this experience listening to our expert panelists. I hope you as well enjoyed this building block series on leasing.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.